Get up. That seat is reserved for a real VIP. The words cracked through the private first-class lounge with the confidence of someone who had never imagined being questioned, and for a heartbeat, every conversation dissolved into silence. Coffee cups paused halfway to waiting lips. Laptop keyboards stopped clicking. Even the television mounted above the fireplace seemed quieter as dozens of eyes turned toward the woman who had just been singled out. Naomi Brooks slowly lifted her gaze from the report resting on her tablet. She didn't flinch. She didn't sigh. She simply looked at the white lounge manager standing over her as though she had heard the sentence many times before. Claire Whitman folded her arms neatly across her navy blazer, wearing the practiced smile of someone convinced authority could never be mistaken. "I'm going to need you to move," she said again, her voice polite enough to sound professional, but sharp enough to leave no room for disagreement. "Our VIP guest will be arriving any second." Naomi glanced at the boarding pass resting beside her coffee. Seat 1A. First class. Lounge access confirmed. Everything had been booked weeks earlier under her legal name. Everything was exactly as it should have been. Around her, travelers exchanged uncertain glances. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked amused. A middle-aged businessman quietly shook his head before returning to his phone, deciding it wasn't his problem. Across the lounge, a young employee behind the reception desk named Ethan Miller glanced nervously toward the reservation screen in front of him. Something about this interaction felt wrong, but before he could say anything, Claire shot him a quick warning look that told him to stay silent. Naomi closed the cover of her tablet with calm, deliberate hands. She wore dark jeans, a fitted black sweater, white sneakers, and no jewelry beyond a simple silver watch. There was no designer handbag, no luxury logo, no entourage waiting outside. She looked like someone catching a routine flight after an ordinary business trip. That was exactly the point. For nearly 6 months, anonymous complaints had reached the Executive Ethics Office describing passengers who claimed they had been judged before anyone checked their tickets. The stories sounded remarkably similar. Guests dressed casually were questioned. Travelers of color were challenged more often. Employees insisted they were only following policy. Statistics suggested otherwise. Naomi had decided the only way to discover the truth was to become invisible. She wanted employees to react to her appearance before they reacted to her name. Now, sitting quietly in a leather chair overlooking the runway, she had her answer far sooner than expected. The automatic doors opened, and a tall white man in an expensive charcoal suit entered with effortless confidence. Richard Langford barely looked around before smiling at Claire. "Morning," he said. "I assume my seat's ready." Claire smiled warmly. "Of course, Mr. Langford. We had a small inconvenience, but we're taking care of it now." Richard's eyes drifted toward Naomi for only a second before he gave an almost amused shrug. "I'm sure she'll understand," he said casually. "Some people don't realize premium spaces are reserved for premium guests." A few nervous chuckles escaped from nearby travelers. Naomi remained perfectly still. Her expression never changed. She had learned years ago that prejudice often revealed itself most clearly when it believed no consequences were coming. And at that very moment, inside the quiet elegance of an airport lounge where polished marble reflected the morning sunlight, everyone was about to discover that the woman they believed didn't belong was the last person they should have underestimated. Claire Whitman extended one hand toward the aisle without raising her voice, as though the decision had already been made. "You can take one of the standard seats outside the lounge until boarding begins," she said. "Our premium guests expect a certain experience." Naomi Brooks looked at the empty chair across from her, then at the panoramic windows overlooking the runway where aircraft taxied beneath a bright morning sky. Nothing about the room suggested urgency. There were plenty of available seats. The issue had never been space. It had become something else the moment Claire decided appearances mattered more than verification. Naomi folded her boarding pass once and placed it carefully beside her coffee cup. "My reservation is assigned to this seat," she answered evenly. "If there is a problem, I would appreciate you showing me the policy." Claire smiled again, although the warmth had disappeared from her expression. "The policy allows management to make accommodations when necessary." Richard Langford loosened the cuffs of his tailored jacket and stepped closer, carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to having rooms rearranged before he entered them. "I have another meeting after we land," he said casually. I would rather not waste time waiting. Claire nodded immediately. You will not have to. Ethan Miller watched the reservation monitor once more. Naomi Brooks. Confirmed. Executive priority. Lounge access verified. Every line on the screen contradicted what was unfolding only a few feet away. His fingers hovered above the keyboard before stopping. Claire had worked there for nearly 12 years. Ethan had been employed for less than 6 months. Challenging her publicly felt impossible. Naomi noticed the hesitation in his eyes, but said nothing. Experience had taught her that people often recognized injustice long before they found the courage to confront it. Across the lounge, 2 travelers quietly exchanged whispers. One woman frowned as she glanced between Naomi and Richard. Another passenger lowered his newspaper just enough to keep watching. The atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. Curiosity replaced comfort. Claire reached toward Naomi's boarding pass. May I see this again? Naomi slid it across the table without resistance. Claire glanced at the document for less than 2 seconds before handing it back. She never scanned the barcode. She never checked the identification resting beside the tablet. Instead, she looked directly at Naomi and said, "Sometimes these situations happen when guests misunderstand the level of access they purchased." Richard released a quiet laugh. It happens more often than you would think. Naomi met his eyes for the first time. I do not believe confusion is the issue. Today, Richard shrugged. Then making a scene certainly is not helping. Naomi remained composed. Years earlier, long before magazine covers and board meetings became part of her life, she had entered a corporate conference wearing a simple navy dress and carrying presentation notes that represented 3 years of work. A receptionist had asked whether she was delivering coffee for the executives upstairs. The room had apologized after discovering she was leading the investment presentation, but the apology never erased the assumption. That memory had followed her into every boardroom she ever entered. It had shaped the company she eventually built and the standards she expected from every business connected to her name. Today was never supposed to become another lesson. She had planned to observe quietly, review service anonymously, board her flight, and file recommendations later. Instead, the test had arrived before she finished her first cup of coffee. Claire straightened her blazer once more. "This is your final opportunity to cooperate voluntarily," she said with polished certainty. Naomi looked toward the reception desk where Ethan still stood frozen beside the glowing reservation screen. She could see the conflict on his face as clearly as if it had been written across the monitor itself, and she realized the next few minutes would reveal far more than who belonged in a particular seat. They would reveal who was willing to stand for the truth when silence felt safer. The silence stretched just long enough for everyone in the lounge to become part of the moment whether they wanted to or not. Claire Whitman took one measured step closer to Naomi Brooks and lowered her voice, as though speaking quietly made the situation more professional. "If you continue refusing to cooperate, I will have security assist you." Naomi looked up with the same calm expression she had worn since the first word had been spoken. "Assist me with what exactly?" she asked. "Sitting in the seat assigned to me?" Claire did not answer the question. Instead, she turned toward the reception desk. "Ethan, call security." Ethan Miller looked from Claire to the reservation screen, and then back again. Every detail in the system remained unchanged. Naomi Brooks. Confirmed reservation. Executive priority. Lounge privileges active. There was no warning. No conflict. No indication that she had violated a single policy. His throat tightened. "Claire," he began carefully. "The reservation appears to be valid." Claire's expression hardened immediately. "I did not ask whether it appears valid. I asked you to call security." Ethan hesitated. The room seemed to shrink around him. He remembered his first week on the job when Claire proudly explained that following management without hesitation was the reason she had become the senior lounge manager. Now he wondered whether obedience and integrity could survive in the same workplace. Richard Langford glanced at his watch with theatrical impatience. "This really should not take so long," he said. "People who belong in premium lounges usually know how these situations work." Naomi turned toward him. "How do they work?" she asked quietly. Richard smiled without warmth. "When someone more important arrives, reasonable people make room." Naomi nodded once. Interesting definition of importance. A woman seated near the windows finally closed the novel she had been pretending to read. Her boarding pass identified her as Maya Thompson. She had watched the exchange from the beginning, hoping someone on the staff would simply verify the facts and end the misunderstanding. Instead, the conversation kept drifting farther away from facts and closer to assumptions. "Excuse me," Maya said, her voice steady enough for everyone nearby to hear. "She has shown her boarding pass more than once. Why has nobody scanned it?" Several passengers quietly looked toward Claire, waiting for an answer. Claire forced another smile. "Ma'am, we appreciate your concern, but this is an internal matter." Maya folded her arms. It became everyone's concern the moment it happened in front of an entire lounge. A low murmur spread across the room. Another traveler slowly lowered his laptop screen. An older couple stopped discussing their vacation altogether. Nobody returned to what they had been doing. Naomi remained seated, saying nothing. She understood something many people never learned. When prejudice is allowed enough time, it often begins exposing itself without any help. Claire reached for the lounge phone on the counter. "Security to the executive lounge, please." Her words echoed softly across the polished marble and glass. Richard exhaled with visible satisfaction as though the matter had finally been settled. Ethan stared at the monitor one last time before quietly opening Naomi's reservation details again. This time another line caught his attention. Hidden beneath the standard booking information was an internal designation he had never seen before. Access level, ownership executive review. His heartbeat quickened. He clicked the profile again to make certain he had not imagined it. The same designation appeared. Ownership. Ethan looked slowly toward Naomi. She never acknowledged him, never smiled, never hinted that she knew what he had just discovered. She simply sat with the composure of someone who had already accepted that truth did not become stronger because it was spoken loudly. Outside the lounge windows, another aircraft rolled toward the runway, while inside the room the approaching footsteps of airport security grew closer with every passing second. And Ethan realized the next decision would determine far more than who occupied a single leather chair. Two airport security officers entered the lounge without urgency, responding to what they assumed would be another routine disagreement between travelers. Their polished shoes echoed softly across the marble floor before they stopped beside Claire Whitman. "What seems to be the issue?" one of them asked. Claire answered before anyone else could speak. "This guest has refused repeated instructions to relocate after we explained that the seating arrangement needed to change for another passenger." The officer turned toward Naomi Brooks with a calm expression. "Ma'am, would you mind explaining your side?" Naomi met his eyes without the slightest hint of frustration. "I checked in using a valid boarding pass, entered the lounge through the approved gate, sat in the seat assigned to my reservation, and have asked several times for someone to verify the information before asking me to leave." The officer nodded thoughtfully. "Did anyone scan the boarding pass after the concern was raised?" The question lingered in the air. Claire answered immediately. That was unnecessary because the circumstances were already clear. Before the officer could respond, Maya Thompson stood from her chair. "No, they were not clear," she said firmly. "I have watched this entire conversation." She offered her boarding pass. Nobody properly checked it. They looked at her before they looked at her reservation. The room grew noticeably quieter. Another passenger, an older man seated near the fireplace, slowly removed his reading glasses. "She is right," he added. "I have been sitting here since before either of them arrived. They made assumptions first and asked questions later." Claire forced a restrained smile. "Everyone is missing the larger picture. We are simply trying to accommodate an important customer." Richard Langford adjusted his suit jacket and spoke with polished confidence. "There is no reason to create unnecessary tension. This could have been resolved 5 minutes ago if everyone had exercised common courtesy." Maya looked directly at him. "Courtesy does not mean surrendering your rights because someone else believes they deserve them more." Several travelers quietly nodded. Ethan Miller could feel the atmosphere shifting around him. Only minutes earlier, nearly everyone had remained silent, avoiding involvement. Now the witnesses were beginning to speak one after another, not because they knew Naomi's identity, but because they recognized unfairness when they saw it. He looked back at the reservation system once more. Ownership executive review. The words remained on the screen exactly as before. His pulse quickened. Training manuals had mentioned special ownership designations only once during orientation, explaining that those profiles belonged to executive leadership and required immediate verification through corporate support if questions ever arose. Ethan swallowed hard. Claire had skipped every required step. She had never contacted corporate. She had never requested confirmation. She had relied entirely on her first impression. "Claire," Ethan said carefully, his voice steadier than before, "I think we should verify the executive profile through headquarters before we continue." Claire turned sharply toward him. "There is nothing to verify." Ethan took a slow breath. "Actually, there is." For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty crossed Claire's face. It lasted only a second before she dismissed it. "You are new here," she replied. "Leave management decisions to management." Ethan looked down briefly, then reached toward the internal phone resting beside the reservation terminal. His hand paused above the receiver. Naomi watched the movement without saying a word. She neither encouraged him nor discouraged him. The decision had to belong to him alone. Around the lounge, every conversation had stopped completely. Travelers who had arrived expecting nothing more dramatic than coffee before boarding now found themselves watching a young employee choose between protecting a superior or protecting the truth. Ethan finally lifted the receiver, his fingers tightening around it as he quietly realized that one verified phone call could answer every question that assumptions never could. Claire Whitman reached across the small table and placed 2 fingers on the back of the leather chair, not touching Naomi Brooks, but making her intention unmistakably clear. "Ma'am, I am asking you one last time to stand up voluntarily," she said, her patience carefully rehearsed but beginning to crack around the edges. "We have already spent far too much time on this." Naomi slowly looked at the hand resting against the chair before lifting her eyes to Claire once again. "And I have spent this entire conversation asking for one simple thing," she replied. "Verify the facts before judging the person." Claire pulled her hand away with visible frustration. "We have all the information we need." Naomi answered quietly, "No, you decided you did." The words settled over the lounge with surprising weight. Even the security officers remained silent, sensing that this confrontation had become something larger than a disagreement over seating. Richard Langford sighed dramatically and glanced toward the departure board through the tall windows. "This is becoming embarrassing for everyone involved," he said. "Surely common sense has to prevail eventually." Naomi looked at him calmly. "Common sense usually begins with evidence." Richard smiled thinly but offered no response. The room seemed suspended between 2 versions of reality, one built on assumptions, the other waiting patiently for someone willing to verify the truth. As Ethan Miller stood beside the reservation terminal with the internal phone still in his hand, Naomi found herself remembering another room many years earlier. She had been 24 years old, carrying the only business proposal she believed could change her future. She had arrived 30 minutes early for an investment meeting after driving nearly 400 miles through the night because she could not afford another hotel stay. The receptionist had looked past her 3 separate times before finally asking whether she was delivering documents for one of the executives upstairs. When Naomi explained that she was the entrepreneur scheduled to present the proposal, the woman laughed politely and asked her to wait until the actual presenter arrived. 20 minutes later, the investors themselves walked into the lobby, recognized her from earlier correspondence, and apologized for the misunderstanding. They had eventually funded her company, but the apology never erased the lesson. The room had changed the moment people realized who she was. What had never changed was who she had been before they recognized her name. That memory stayed with her through every acquisition, every board meeting, and every award ceremony. It reminded her that prejudice rarely announced itself honestly. It disguised itself as procedure, policy, experience, or professional judgment until someone challenged it with facts. Back in the present, the polished marble floor reflected the morning sunlight pouring through the lounge windows, making the entire room appear brighter than it felt. Maya Thompson quietly walked closer to Naomi without invading her space. "You have handled this with remarkable patience," she said. Softly, Naomi gave a small appreciative nod. Anger would only distract from what is actually happening. One of the security officers looked toward Claire again. "I still believe the reservation should be verified before we ask anyone to leave." Claire folded her arms tighter. "Verification is unnecessary." Ethan finally lifted his eyes from the reservation screen. The ownership executive review designation remained impossible to ignore. He understood now that every additional minute without verification was making the situation worse, not better. Taking a slow breath, he pressed the first number on the corporate verification line, knowing that once the call connected, assumptions would no longer have anywhere to hide. The corporate verification line rang only once before a calm, professional voice answered. Executive Operations. This is Daniel Mercer speaking. Ethan Miller swallowed before introducing himself. This is Ethan from the Executive First Class Lounge at Jefferson International Airport. I need to verify an ownership executive review reservation. The words had barely left his mouth when the tone on the other end changed completely. Please provide the passenger's full name immediately. Ethan looked at the reservation screen. Naomi Brooks. Silence filled the line for less than a second before Daniel answered with unmistakable urgency. Do not disconnect. I am pulling the executive profile now. Ethan placed the call on speaker without realizing everyone in the lounge had gone completely quiet. Claire Whitman stepped toward the desk. Take that off speaker, she ordered. Ethan did not move. Daniel returned almost instantly. Confirmation complete. Naomi Brooks is verified at the highest executive ownership level. She is conducting a confidential executive service evaluation authorized directly by the Board Ethics Committee. May I ask why verification was requested? Claire's face lost its confident expression for the first time that morning. Ethan answered honestly. There has been a disagreement regarding seating. Another brief silence followed. Daniel's voice became slower and more deliberate. Has Ms. Brooks been denied access to any service connected to her reservation? Ethan hesitated. Naomi quietly looked toward him and gave the slightest nod, encouraging nothing more than honesty. Yes, Ethan replied. She was instructed to surrender her assigned seat before verification was completed. The temperature inside the lounge seemed to change. Richard Langford stopped adjusting his cufflinks. One of the security officers exchanged a quick glance with his partner. Maya Thompson quietly folded her arms, already sensing the direction this conversation was taking. Daniel spoke again. Please remain exactly where you are. Do not alter any reservation records. Do not close the incident. I am notifying Executive Ethics, Corporate Guest Experience, and the Office of the Chief Operating Officer immediately. Claire stepped closer to the desk. This is completely unnecessary. We were simply accommodating a valued customer. Daniel answered before Ethan could respond. Every customer is entitled to equal treatment under company policy. Ownership status is not the issue. Verification procedures exist specifically to prevent assumptions from replacing facts. No one in the lounge spoke. Naomi remained seated exactly as she had been since the confrontation began, her hands resting calmly beside the untouched coffee that had long since grown cold. She had not demanded special treatment. She had not raised her voice. She had simply waited for someone to follow the rules that already existed. Daniel continued. Ms. Brooks has full authority to activate the executive review protocol at her discretion. If she chooses to do so, all audio records, reservation logs, internal communications, and lounge surveillance from this incident will be preserved automatically. Claire stared at Naomi as though seeing her for the first time. Richard slowly shifted his weight, the confidence that had carried him into the lounge beginning to disappear. Ethan lowered the receiver slightly, realizing the call he had almost been afraid to make had changed the entire room without a single raised voice. Naomi finally reached for her own phone. She unlocked the screen, selected one contact, and placed a comm call of her own. The line connected almost immediately. Good morning, Ms. Brooks, her executive assistant answered. Naomi spoke with the same quiet composure she had maintained from the beginning. Rebecca, please activate Executive Review Protocol 7. Preserve every record from the executive lounge beginning with my arrival. Notify the Ethics Committee that the evaluation is complete. I believe they will want to hear exactly how today's decisions were made before anyone knew who I was. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument, because everyone standing in that lounge now understood that the truth had finally arrived, and it had done so with nothing more than a single verified phone call. Naomi Brooks ended the call and gently placed her phone beside the untouched cup of coffee. Nothing about her posture changed. She had not stood to make herself appear larger. She had not spoken louder to make herself appear stronger. The room itself had shifted around her. Claire Whitman stared across the lounge, searching for an explanation that no longer existed. Every assumption she had trusted only minutes earlier had collapsed beneath verified facts. Richard Langford cleared his throat and forced an uneasy smile. "Well," he said carefully, "it appears there has been a misunderstanding." Naomi looked at him without anger. "No," she answered softly. "There was an assumption. Those are not the same thing." The words settled over the room with remarkable clarity. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. Even the departure announcements echoing faintly through the terminal seemed distant. Claire finally found her voice. "Ms. Brooks, had we known who you were, this never would have happened." Naomi stood slowly, smoothing the sleeve of her black sweater before meeting Claire's eyes. "That sentence is exactly why we are here." Claire blinked in confusion. Naomi continued, her voice calm enough that everyone in the lounge leaned forward to hear every word. "You asked me to surrender my seat for a VIP." She paused for only a moment. "You never stopped to consider that I had already earned the seat assigned to me." Another quiet second passed before she delivered the sentence that seemed to stop time inside the lounge. "You believed I did not belong on an airline that I own." A visible wave of disbelief moved across the room. Maya Thompson slowly covered her mouth with one hand. One of the security officers looked toward Ethan Miller as if hoping he would deny what had just been said, but Ethan simply lowered his eyes and gave a small confirming nod. Richard's confident posture disappeared almost instantly. "You own the airline?" he asked quietly. Naomi answered without hesitation. "I serve as Chief Executive Officer of Brooks Global Ventures. 2 years ago, our company became the majority owner of this airline. I came here anonymously because I wanted to understand how ordinary passengers experience our service when nobody believes they have influence." Claire's shoulders dropped. Her carefully rehearsed authority dissolved into stunned silence. Ethan spoke for the first time since the corporate verification call ended. The executive profile confirmed everything. His voice carried through the room with unmistakable certainty. "Ownership Executive Review. Board authorized." It was all there before any of this began. Richard looked away, unable to meet Naomi's eyes. "I never realized." Naomi gently interrupted him. "Exactly. You never realized. You decided." She turned slowly, looking around the lounge at the passengers who had witnessed every moment. The problem today was never a seat. It was how quickly people decided who deserved respect before they checked the facts. Maya nodded quietly. "That is what all of us saw." One of the security officers removed the small incident notebook from his pocket and closed it without writing another word. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "thank you for remaining patient." Naomi offered a polite smile. "Patience reveals character. Mine and everyone else's." Across the reception desk, Claire stood motionless, understanding that the truth had not humiliated her because of Naomi's title. It had exposed the choices she had made long before anyone knew. The woman sitting quietly in the leather chair was the person ultimately responsible for setting the standards the entire airline was expected to uphold. The lounge remained silent long after Naomi Brooks finished speaking. No one rushed to fill the empty space because the truth had already done that. Claire Whitman looked toward the reception desk as though hoping someone would rescue her from the consequences of her own decisions. But every face reflected the same realization. The issue had never been policy. It had been judgment. Ethan Miller's desk phone rang again. He answered immediately. "Executive Operations," the voice on the other end said. "Please place this call on speaker." Ethan complied without hesitation. The calm voice continued. "This is Daniel Mercer. Effective immediately, Executive Ethics has initiated a formal review of the incident that occurred in the executive lounge this morning. All reservation records, surveillance footage, internal communications, and employee statements have been secured." Claire lowered her head slightly. Daniel continued. "Pending the outcome of the investigation, Claire Whitman is being relieved of supervisory authority effective immediately. Another manager will assume operational responsibility for this lounge today." Nobody celebrated. The announcement landed with quiet finality rather than drama. Claire slowly removed her employee identification badge from her blazer and placed it on the reception counter without saying a word. Daniel spoke again. "Mr. Ethan Miller, Executive Ethics requests that you remain available to provide a factual statement regarding today's events. Your decision to request proper verification before further action has been noted." Ethan blinked in surprise. "Thank you," he answered quietly. "I simply followed the procedures that should have been followed from the beginning." Daniel replied. That is exactly why your actions matter. The call ended. Richard Langford stood motionless for several seconds before taking a slow breath. He looked toward Naomi with a humility that had been absent only minutes earlier. Ms. Brooks, he said, I owe you an apology. I accepted special treatment without questioning how it affected someone else. I should have spoken differently. Naomi nodded respectfully. Acknowledging a mistake is where improvement begins. Richard accepted the answer without attempting to excuse himself further. Nearby, Maya Thompson smiled faintly. I hope this changes more than one lounge, she said. Naomi answered, that is why I came. One of the security officers stepped forward. For what it is worth, thank you for insisting that we verify the facts before acting. We often arrive after decisions have already been made. Today reminded us why questions matter. Naomi extended her hand, and the officer shook it respectfully. Around the lounge, passengers quietly returned to their conversations, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The tension that had filled the room was gone, replaced by thoughtful silence. Several travelers offered Naomi small smiles as they walked past. Others nodded without saying anything at all. Their gestures were simple, but they carried genuine respect. Ethan stepped away from the reception desk and approached Naomi. I almost stayed silent, he admitted. I kept telling myself someone else would speak first. Naomi smiled warmly. Courage is rarely loud. Sometimes it begins with one person deciding that the truth deserves a chance. Ethan looked toward the reservation terminal where the executive profile was still displayed. I will remember today for the rest of my career. Naomi picked up her tablet and the cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. So will I, she replied. Not because people recognize my title, but because eventually they chose to recognize the facts. Moments later, the newly assigned lounge manager arrived, greeted Naomi with professionalism, and assured every passenger that the lounge would continue operating normally while the corporate review moved forward. The morning flights would depart on schedule, but everyone who had witnessed those few extraordinary minutes understood that something far more important than an itinerary had changed inside that room. Boarding for Flight 217 was announced a few minutes later, and the familiar chime echoed through the executive lounge as travelers quietly gathered their belongings. The room looked almost identical to how it had looked an hour earlier, yet it no longer felt like the same place. The marble floors still reflected the morning light. The leather chairs still faced the wide airport windows. Coffee continued to pour behind the counter. But every person who had witnessed the events of that morning carried away something far more lasting than a boarding pass. Naomi Brooks slipped her tablet into its case and walked toward the lounge entrance at an unhurried pace. The newly assigned lounge manager met her near the doorway. Ms. Brooks, he said respectfully, on behalf of everyone committed to serving our guests with fairness, I sincerely apologize for what happened today. We will cooperate fully with the review. Naomi gave a courteous nod. Thank you. Make sure the review is not about protecting a reputation. Make it about improving the experience for the next traveler who walks through these doors. We will, he answered without hesitation. As Naomi continued toward the boarding gate, Ethan Miller caught up with her. There is one thing I wanted to ask before you leave, he said. Naomi stopped and smiled. Go ahead. Ethan took a careful breath. When everything started going wrong, why did you stay so calm? Naomi looked through the tall windows where another aircraft lifted smoothly into the clear blue sky before answering. Because anger might have won me an argument, she said. Patience revealed the truth. Ethan reflected on those words in silence. I thought leadership meant having authority, he admitted. Naomi shook her head gently. Leadership begins long before authority. It begins when you choose honesty even if it costs you comfort. Ethan smiled with quiet appreciation. I will remember that. I hope you do, Naomi replied. Companies can teach procedures. Character is something each person chooses for themselves. As she reached the gate entrance, Maya Thompson offered one final wave. Safe travels, she called. Naomi smiled warmly. You too. And thank you for speaking when it mattered. Maya laughed softly. I only said what everyone else was already thinking. Naomi answered. Sometimes that is exactly what changes a room. A few nearby passengers nodded in agreement before boarding began. Richard Langford quietly waited until Naomi approached the boarding lane before stepping aside and gesturing toward the entrance. After you, he said sincerely. Naomi thanked him with a simple smile and walked forward without triumph or resentment. Respect freely given carried far more meaning than privilege demanded. Later that afternoon, executive ethics distributed a company-wide reminder reinforcing that every guest must be treated with dignity before assumptions, appearances, or status ever entered the conversation. Verification procedures were updated. Additional training was scheduled across the airline. The evaluation Naomi had quietly begun that morning would improve experiences for thousands of travelers she would never meet. Long after the aircraft disappeared beyond the clouds, people who had been inside that lounge continued telling the story. Not because a chief executive officer had revealed her identity, but because they had witnessed something much more important. They had watched quiet integrity overcome loud assumptions. They had seen fairness restored without insults, without revenge, and without raising a voice. Naomi never fought to prove that she belonged. She allowed the truth to do that for her. And as the cabin settled into peaceful silence high above the clouds, one lesson remained unmistakably clear. Real leadership is never measured by the seat you